Um, Looking around the room, I think I'm in danger of teaching grandparents to suck eggs, but I am also mindful that there are people that won't know about containment. So for the next 20 minutes, I am going to talk about a topic that I believe has never been more relevant to the NHS workforce, and to think about the key role that it has to play in building and maintaining workforce resilience in a healthcare system under unprecedented strain. So I'm going to talk about containment. And as I said, this is a concept that many of you will know and probably teach better than I do. But I will attempt to keep it brief. I recognise that this is not the only answer to NHS challenges, that there are many other practical things required: money, resources, staff, technology. But I do think that containment is key to helping the workforce to manage the emotional labour of the work, and to build workforce resilience and help organisations to function best possible. It works. So, as I've already mentioned and others have mentioned, the NHS today faces a perfect storm of anxiety-provoking forces. As I've said, chronic underfunding meets escalating demand, technological advancement collides with institutional burnout and change fatigue, and the lingering trauma of the pandemic intersects with workforce shortages, leaving many departments running on empty. In psychodynamic terms, we are witnessing a system plagued by survival anxiety. And when anxiety or other emotions become too much to bear, and there's insufficient containment to help support staff to process these emotions, we see precisely some of the issues that we are seeing unfolding across the NHS today: increased sickness, absence, early retirement, staff exodus, silo working, and a pervasive sense that the system itself is unravelling. So let's go back. What do I mean when I talk about containment? Well, often when I ask students on the master's programme to free associate to this word, I get a mixed response. Some of them will say, something supportive, something holding, something benevolent. And others will associate it with restriction, punishment, or confinement. The type of containment that I'm talking about, and I want us to think about, is a concept introduced by Wilfred Bion, who's already been mentioned, a psychoanalyst who worked here at the Tavistock. And the concept derives from a process that he noticed taking place between the infant and the primary carer. A process whereby the infant, overwhelmed by intense feelings with no mind to make sense of what's going on inside of it, cries to communicate its discomfort. The parent, hopefully, hears the cry, feels the discomfort, takes a moment to try and make some sense of it. The parent then communicates its understanding or attempt to understand through words or sound or through actions. It might go something like, "Oh, yes, it's getting close to lunchtime, perhaps you're hungry." And in this process, the parent shows the infant that the experience, first and foremost, is bearable. The parent doesn't fall apart. It also shows that meaning can be made of the experience. Solutions can be considered. And this psychologically contains the infant. It's a process that goes over and over and over, like the Teletubbies, again, until the infant too can actually bear its own emotions. It develops the capacity to begin to make sense of them, the capacity to think, and to find a way forwards, and also not fall apart in the process of experiencing intense emotions. So why am I talking about the mother or the infant and the parent? Well, in adulthood, when we're overwhelmed, you may have found yourself say it yourself sometimes, you might feel like you're falling apart. You might lose the capacity to think things through, to find ways of navigating the way forwards. And you might go and talk to someone, might be a friend, might be somebody professional, might be a family member, just to get help with processing the feelings, get help to regain that capacity to think and to manage, to get your footing again. And just as a parent contains the overwhelming emotions of the infant, In the NHS, doctors and nurses contain patients, and so must managers, leaders and organisations contain staff if thinking is to prevail and productive work can go on. In the NHS, containment operates at multiple levels across the system: individual, team and organisational. And when containment fails at any of these levels, we often see defensive behaviours that I mentioned earlier, but I'll repeat them in case you've forgotten. Avoidance of feelings. I'm sure we can all relate to these. It's not them, it's us. Avoidance of feelings, offloading of these feelings through fighting, scapegoating, leaving. We see competent and emotionally intelligent people lose the capacity to think through problems, to manage their feelings. Or they might retreat into technical solutions, ignoring all emotional realities. Let's have another restructure. At the heart of organisational containment stands the leader, not as a heroic figure with all the answers, but as a containing presence. Someone who can hold the emotional reality of the work while maintaining the capacity to think and act effectively. Why do we need leaders to do this? Because we need our workforce to be able to think. Their expertise needs to come to the fore as we navigate these challenges ahead of us. So drawing on these 3 decades of work with NHS leaders, I want to explore 3 dimensions of this crucial role. First, let's begin with the idea of the containing mind. So the containing leader, let's say, cultivates a containing mind, a mind that can process complex realities, contradictory ideas, without resorting to simplistic solutions or defensive avoidance. This containing mind needs to have what the poet Keats described as negative capability, and Bion later adopted as the capacity to remain uncertain, as Matthew did earlier, without irritable reaching after certainty, fact and reason, but to hold things lightly, to keep ideas open. The leader needs what Bion referred to as binocular vision, the ability to simultaneously see and engage with both the operational and the emotional dimensions of organisational life. The leader needs the capacity to reflect, the capacity to hold both their own emotional state in mind and that of others, and reflect on both. And they need to have systemic awareness to recognise the interplay of all parts of a system, accepting that problems rarely reside just in one troublesome individual, but they emerge from an interplay of multiple factors. In our work with one NHS trust, one clinical director started to use the phrase, "Let me hold that thought" in meetings, and that was not a dismissal at all. It was a genuine commitment to go away and reflect, or to take a few moments and reflect. And this simple linguistic container created space for complexity that might otherwise have been lost in an immediate certainty. So second, beyond mental capacities, containing leadership manifests in a quality of presence. In practice, this means that leaders must serve as emotional containers, as I've said, digesting, transforming projections without retaliating or collapsing. They need to hold the boundary. We need to hold the boundary between knowing and not knowing, acknowledging the limits of what's known, what can be certain, whilst maintaining confidence in the collective capacity of a team or an organisation to find a way forwards through the uncertainty. We need to authorise thoughtful action, create psychological safety, encourage staff to think critically about their work, to share their opinions, to challenge us. And we need to encourage staff and ourselves to name the unspoken, so that those collective anxieties can be spoken to, can be raised above the surface and worked through, and therefore reduce dysfunctional behaviour. One CEO of an NHS trust that we've worked with for over 6 months now, they've recently started putting emotional check-ins into the beginning of the exec meetings, because she recognised through our work together that this simple practice just enables the team to speak to what's going on, to those emotional experiences that if they're not spoken to, if they're left unsaid, might get acted out or manifest in unhelpful dynamics. So not speaking to them doesn't make them go away. They come out in other shapes and form. And she realised that the importance of actually encouraging people to speak up. And thirdly, as leaders, we need to serve as what I would like to call anxiety transformers. And anyone who was around in the 80s, and I think it might have been repeated later, but I'm a bit old for that, will recognise the transformer. And I think it's really important, and it's not easy, and I get it wrong all the time, and I'm sure other leaders will recognise this, but to try not to pass on the anxiety, to try not to just give it straight back, or to get completely saturated by it, to soak it all up and drown in it, but to try and take it in sufficiently to feel it, to digest it, to think about it, and at an appropriate time to give it back to the system to think about in a more manageable form. And in doing so, to demonstrate that these feelings can be borne and thought about. And it's not easy. It's not easy to sit with the disturbance of a system, but that's our job, is to take that in and to experience it. And by doing that, things shift from overwhelming to workable. Because what we're helping people to do is to reframe things, to recognise that what might initially have been perceived as insurmountable, impossible challenges, yes, are difficult, but they might be approachable tasks if we work together. And it can move things from individual blame to shared responsibility and problem solving. It helps people to respond rather than react. So when someone's stimulated by an incident or a situation or a conversation, this process can help us to stop and to think, to process the feelings, to take a moment and to respond rather than to react. And it can help teams to hold both the positive and negative aspects of complex realities, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the desire of people in the healthcare system to give and give and give, and the desire to actually end the shift, hand over and get out. It can help us to hold both those states of mind within us rather than locating them in different people. NHS leaders today, we find ourselves working not just within organisations, but at the interfaces between them, managing the tensions between different professional groups, organisational units, and between the NHS and its wider environment. And this boundary leadership requires containing capacities, requires the ability to translate between different languages and to value differences and different cultures and languages and systems. And it requires the skill to hold multiple realities simultaneously, to take in a different concept rather than push it out and think about it, hold yours and theirs at the same time and consider them. It requires the courage, sometimes I feel the madness, but also the courage to absorb pressures from all sides without falling apart, without losing the capacity to think in an integrated manner. And in our work with teams across systems, we see how leaders who do effectively contain boundary anxieties really do create space for genuine collaboration, while those who don't, those who sort of resist, inadvertently do tend to reinforce silo mentality, which poses a fundamental risk to organisational survival. Consultants in the room. As consultants, we are often brought into organisations to increase that containment function, often following a crisis or during a period of change. And we don't provide solutions. Well, Tavistock Consultants don't provide solutions. We serve as additional containers, enabling leaders and their teams to think differently about their challenges. And this containing function, in my opinion, has never been more vital. In practice, this can take several forms. It can be about creating transitional spaces where experiences can be spoken to, reflective practice groups, balance groups. It can surface systemic dynamics, helping organisations recognise unhelpful dynamics, making them available for thought rather than unconscious enactment. Can build containing capacity. We work to strengthen the internal containers with NHS organisations so that they become more resilient in our absence. One trust brought us in after a series of serious incidents to work with a reported toxic culture with dysfunctional behaviours. And initially we were met with great hostility and quite sort of defensive behaviours. We were told that we were utterly rubbish. We certainly wouldn't be able to help them. And by the time we got to the end of the first session, we went away kind of feeling a bit ashamed, a bit impotent, a bit incompetent, a bit upset, and actually a bit useless. I was working with a colleague and we went away and we acknowledged these feelings, and then we moved to thinking about them. And so rather than falling into it completely and becoming all of those things, or retaliating by saying it's not us that's rubbish, it's you, or denying our feelings, we understood this to be like the baby's cry, as information to think about. It suggested to us that actually they wanted us to know how rotten they felt following these critical incidents on the ward, how upset and ashamed and useless they were feeling. And they wanted us to feel that and to hold that and to help them to manage it. And in time, we were able to help them recognise these feelings and to work through them. And after a period of time, things changed, resulted in less toxicity, more collaboration, and much better outcomes. Today, they still hold reflective spaces without us to process their feelings and experiences and remain a functioning ward. So the future of the NHS depends not just on technical innovation, but on psychological resilience. Our role as consultants is to nurture this resilience by strengthening the containing infrastructure that makes adaptive, creative work possible, even under extreme pressure. Ooh. Seem to be missing one. Missing a slide there. Never mind, I'll talk to it anyway. So, while leadership's crucial, containment can't just rely on exceptional individuals, Matthew, Louise. We must build containing systems. This is still speaking to my consultant colleagues. We must build containing systems that institutionalise these capacities. And drawing on our consulting experience, I suggest 3 key approaches. One is we work with the NHS to revitalise these reflective spaces, to reclaim and protect spaces for reflection. The relentless drive for efficiency has squeezed out many of the forums where healthcare professionals once processed their experiences. Ward rounds have turned into technical exercises. Team meetings can move towards just focusing on operational matters. Supervision becomes a luxury rather than a necessity. My team will tell you we face the same challenges and have to squeeze the space back in to our working life. Our work's demonstrated that even modest investments in reflective practice, balance groups, supervision, learning action learning sets, that this yields substantial returns in staff, in well-being and in retention, because these spaces serve as organisational containers where difficult feelings can be acknowledged and thought about. We also need to develop containing leadership. We need to nurture leadership capacities that extend beyond technical competence to emotional intelligence. Our leadership development programs emphasise what we might call containment competencies, the ability to recognise anxiety or intense emotions in oneself and in others, and to make use of that information, the capacity to think under fire, and the willingness to engage with the emotional undercurrents of organisational life. At another trust where we delivered a 3-day course for an exec team, teaching them about team dynamics and containment, we noticed a significant shift in how leaders responded to crisis, not because it was taught down the system, but because the execs began to behave differently and it trickled down the system. And the leadership's culture started to move from reactive firefighting to a more thoughtful stance, just taking a moment to think, and that was providing containment. This trust moved dramatically up the league tables as we were working with them. And three, redesigning organisational boundaries. We really do need to attend to how organisational boundaries are conceptualised and managed. The fragmentation of the NHS into competing units that we now see has created what Isabel Manguis Lythe might have described as a perfect system for the institutionalised evasion of anxiety, where difficult emotions are shuttled across boundaries rather than contained. So when we work across divisions with NHS trusts to establish joint containment structures, shared reflective forums, collaborative leadership initiatives, we see not only improved patient outcomes, but also a significant reduction in staff burnout. So as we look to the future, I think that the concept of containment offers both a diagnosis and a remedy for many of the current challenges that we're facing, and I think Matthew was speaking to that earlier. So for the NHS leaders amongst us today, I offer 3 practical takeaways that you can begin implementing tomorrow. The first is to create protective, reflective spaces, even in scarcity. So obviously, in the face of overwhelming operational pressures, the temptation is to take those away. It's a bit like for the individual. When you're stressed and you're busy, you might take away your morning walk or your time to go for a run where you get the chance to think. So the challenge to leaders is to resist that temptation. Even 30 minutes of protected, reflective time each week can dramatically increase your system's capacity for containment. These spaces are not luxuries. They're necessities. And don't forget yourselves. Containers need containment. That's Beyond, not me. Get yourselves a coach. Talk to other leaders. Create leadership forums to digest together. Talk about your emotions. Show your vulnerability. Put your own oxygen mask on first. And get that for your exec team as well. Getting support is strength, not weakness. Role model it. And attend to the emotional temperature of transitions. Healthcare, as I've discussed, is undergoing constant change, each transition generating anxiety. If that's uncontained, it can and will derail even the most logical reforms. Before implementing new structures or processes, deliberately create forums where fears and uncertainties can be expressed. Remember that transitions require psychological as well as operational planning. And finally, I challenge you to practice conscious incompleteness in your leadership. The NHS faces so many problems that cannot be solved, only managed. And paradoxically, acknowledging the impossibility of complete solutions actually creates more space for more realistic approaches to try and manage them. By modelling the capacity to hold contradictions, tolerate partial success, you create conditions where your teams can work creatively within constraints rather than being utterly paralysed by them. And to my fellow consultants, a brief challenge to you to keep on doing what you're doing. Hold the systemic perspective when organisations are pulled towards reductionist thinking and you're pulled to move with them, you're seduced into it. Model containment in your own practice, demonstrating the very capacities that we seek to develop in others. Make sure you have your own containment to support and to maintain your resilience and capacity to think under fire. And build lasting containing infrastructures rather than offering temporary relief. There is enough work for all of us. There is enough work to be done. Our success is leaving a sustainable organisation to manage without us. Together, we can create a more containing NHS. For 30 years, Tavistock Consulting has championed this approach, swimming against the tide of quick fix solutions and mechanical thinking. Today, as the limitations of those approaches become increasingly apparent to us, I think our perspective is finding new resonance. The path forwards will not be easy. Building containing systems requires resources, commitment, and a willingness to engage with uncomfortable realities. In order to contain, we have to be willing to be disturbed by the system and to manage that. Yet I remain convinced that this approach offers our best hope for an NHS where staff can thrive rather than merely survive, where care remains humane in the face of mounting pressures and the noble mission of the health service can be sustained for generations to come. So as we celebrate 30 years of Tavistock Consulting, let us recommit to this vision, not as an idealistic dream, but as a practical necessity for the future of healthcare for our nation. Thank you.